In the autumn of 1341, a Norwegian cleric named Ivar Bardason rounds a headland on the western coast of Greenland, expecting to find a settlement. What he finds instead is silence. Livestock still graze in the fields. Fires have gone cold. An entire community of Norse men, women, and children has vanished. Not into starvation, but into something far stranger. The Inuit are thriving on the same coastline at this same moment, eating seal, hunting whale, surviving the same brutal cold that is supposedly killing the Norse. The tools for survival are right there. The knowledge exists. And yet the Norse, who have lived on this island for over 3 centuries, refuse to use any of it. They will not hunt seal. They will not wear animal skin the way the Inuit wear it. They will not abandon the cattle farms that the cooling climate is slowly strangling. They are watching their own extinction arrive and choosing, with what appears to be absolute collective certainty, to remain exactly who they are. The question that has haunted historians for 600 years is not how they died. It is why they refused to live. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight, and I am genuinely curious what you think. Was the Norse refusal to adapt a fatal flaw, or was holding on to their identity the only thing that made their civilization worth saving in the first place? He expects noise. That is the first thing to understand about Ivar Bardason as his vessel rounds the headland in the autumn of 1341. He is a Norwegian cleric, a man of the church, trained in the management of dioceses and the keeping of records, and he has sailed hundreds of miles along a coastline that offers nothing to the eye but ice and stone and the occasional smear of thin green where the land dips toward the water. He has endured all of that silence because he knows it will end. He carries letters. He carries instructions. He carries the bureaucratic weight of an institution that has maintained a diocese in this place for more than 3 centuries. And when a man like Ivar Bardason rounds a headland toward a settlement of several hundred souls, he does not brace for silence. He braces for the noise that human habitation makes, the particular, layered, irreducible sound of people living in proximity to each other and to their animals, cattle, dogs, the voices of women calling to children across a yard, the knock of iron on stone, on wood, on iron, the accumulated percussion of a community at work. He hears nothing, not the silence of a winter morning when cold presses sound flat against the earth and the world holds its breath until the sun climbs high enough to release it. Not the silence of a Sunday when labor pauses and the settlement gathers itself toward prayer. This is a different quality of silence entirely, and Bardason knows the difference before his vessel has finished its turn, before he has seen anything at all, before a single detail has presented itself to his trained and careful eye. He knows it the way a man who has spent his life around fire knows a cold room, not by evidence, but by the body's own reading of the air. Some register of perception below the threshold of thought that says this is wrong. This is not right. Something here is missing that cannot be accounted for. He steps ashore. The settlement lies before him in the thin autumn light, and it is intact. That is the first thing the eye reports, and it is the thing that the mind struggles longest to absorb. The farmsteads stand, the stone walls that mark off the fields from each other, that have been built and repaired and extended over generations of habitation, still hold their lines across the hillside. The turf and stone of the longhouses sits undisturbed, the roof lines unbroken, the door frames upright in their positions. There is no wreckage here, no evidence of fire, which is the first thing a man looks for, because fire is the most common grammar of catastrophe. The way violence writes itself on a landscape. No scorched timber, no collapsed walls, no the particular black signature that destruction leaves on stone. The buildings of the western settlement stand in the autumn light exactly as they were built to stand. serving their original purpose, which was to shelter human life, and failing in that purpose completely, because there is no human life here to shelter. Bardason moves through the settlements the way he moves through everything, methodically, farmstead by farmstead, door by door. He is not a dramatic man. He is not, so far as the record suggests, a man given to large feeling or poetic interpretation. He is an administrator, which means he's a man who has trained himself to see what is there rather than what he fears or hopes, to record rather than to interpret, to let the ledger speak without editorial embellishment. And so he moves, and the ledger accumulates its entries. Cold hearths, sleeping benches empty and undisturbed, the furs and skins still arranged as though their occupants have simply risen and stepped outside for a moment. Wooden implements set down in the middle of tasks that were never completed. The material texture of interrupted life, preserved in the cold with a fidelity that is almost unbearable. Almost, but not quite, because Bardason does not allow it to be unbearable. He looks, and he notes, and he moves to the next door. The horror here is not destruction. That is the thing to understand. The thing that Bardason's account has lodged in the historical record like a splinter that cannot be removed, that has puzzled and haunted the scholars who come after him for centuries. Destruction has a grammar, a sequence of cause and effect that the mind can follow even in grief, even in horror. Destruction leaves evidence of itself, and evidence is something a trained mind can process. What Bardason finds in the Western settlement has no grammar. Nothing has been broken. Nothing has been taken that would not have been taken by people leaving of their own accord, by choice, deliberately. The objects that remain are the objects that remain when people go. The heavy things, the fixed things, the things that cannot be carried, the things that have been deemed, in whatever calculus governed the departure, not worth the effort of transport. These are the objects of a household that has been vacated, not a civilization that has been destroyed. And the distinction is precisely what makes the mind slide and lose its footing. He finds the animals. They are there in the fields, in the thin late-season grass, and they are alive. Cattle, moving without purpose across the hillside, grazing where there is grass to graze, and standing still where there is not, indifferent to the absence that surrounds them. They have been here long enough to have developed their own patterns in the absence of human direction, their own loose geography of movement across the land. They are not starving, not yet. Though the season is turning, and what the land offers is diminishing by the day. They are simply present in the way that animals are present, without narrative, without the consciousness of what has happened to them or what it means. Without the specifically human capacity for understanding that the world they were bred into no longer exists. They have outlasted the civilization that bred them, and they do not know it. And perhaps that is the most vertiginous fact of all. Bardason does not dwell on this. He is not the dwelling type. He notes the animals. He makes his practical assessment. He begins the work of salvage. What he loads onto his vessel and what he leaves behind tells its own story. The story of a man doing the only sensible thing available to him in the face of the incomprehensible. The living he can take, the structures he cannot, and would not if he could, because stone and turf belong to the land in a way that cattle do not. He works with the efficient purposefulness of a man who has given himself a task to prevent himself from sitting down in the middle of an empty farmstead and staring at a cold hearth until the light fails. He works because the alternative to work, in a place like this, on a day like this, is something he is not prepared to face. The church trained him to observe and record, and he observes and records, and when there is nothing more to observe and record, he loads his salvage and he prepares to sail. He will write this down. That is perhaps the most important thing about Ivar Bardason. Not what he saw, but the fact that he writes it down, that he carries the account of what he found back into the documentary record and sets it there like a stone placed to mark a spot on a featureless plain. His account will survive him. It will outlast the Western settlement itself, outlast the Eastern settlement that lingers on for another half-century or more, outlast the last Norse fire in the last Norse hearth on this island. It will pass through the hands of scholars and historians and cartographers who will read it again, and find in it the same open question that Bardason himself found in those empty doorframes, not what destroyed them, but where did they go, and how does a community of hundreds dissolve without leaving a wound? Because this is the question. This is the question that the silence of the Western settlement poses and refuses to answer. A catastrophe leaves evidence of its nature. A plague leaves bodies, or the memory of bodies, or the mass graves that mark the sudden acceleration of mortality. A raid leaves the grammar of violence, the burned structures, the scattered objects, the evidence of speed and terror, and the particular disorder that panic produces. A famine leaves bones, and bones tell their own story to those who know how to read them. Even a slow decline, a community dwindling year by year, as the young leave for better prospects and the old remain, leaves a record of itself, a skewing of the population, a clustering of burials in the final years, a legible narrative of diminishment. The Western settlement offers none of these. It offers empty rooms and wandering cattle and the complete, unaccountable absence of the people who built this place and lived in it for 3 centuries, and then, at some point, that the record cannot fix with precision, simply were not here anymore. Where did they go? The question hangs in the air over the empty fields, the way the cold hangs, pervasive, sourceless, settling into everything. It will hang there for the rest of recorded time, and the answers that scholars propose will be various and contradictory, and none of them entirely satisfying, because the truth of what happened in the Western settlement resists the tidy resolution that the human mind craves. There are theories. There will always be theories. But theories are the living world's attempt to impose grammar on a silence that has no grammar, and the silence resists. Bardason's ship moves out into the fjord. The settlement recedes behind him, its stone walls and turf roofs growing smaller against the hillside, its empty doorframes resolving into the general texture of the land, until it is possible, at a certain distance, to mistake it for something that was never inhabited at all, for a natural feature of this landscape, a cluster of rock formations, a fold in the earth that happens to suggest Tutur. He either does not know what it is looking at, the forms of human construction. The cattle are still visible on the hillside for a while, small moving shapes against the thin grass, and then the distance takes them too, and there is only the land and the ice-choked fjord and the silence that Bardason is leaving behind. It is not the silence of death. Death has a weight to it, a gravity, a sense of something completed even in its violence or its sorrow. What Bardason leaves behind is lighter than that and more terrible. The silence of absence, of a world that did not end but simply stopped, of a community that was here and is not here. And the distance between those two conditions is not a wound, but a vanishing, which is a different and more vertiginous thing entirely. A wound can be examined. A vanishing can only be stared at, the way you stare at the place where something was before you understood it was gone, turning the absence over in your mind, looking for the seam where the world changed, finding nothing. The fields are empty. The hearths are cold. The animals graze on. It begins, as most human catastrophes begin, not with the end, but with the beginning, with noise and salt air and the particular chaos of people who have decided to believe in something. The year is 985 CE. The coastline of Iceland is crowded with ships. 25 of them. The sagas are specific about this number, and specificity in the sagas is always worth attending to, because these are not people who count it casually. 25 ships loaded with cattle and sheep and the disassembled timber frames of houses with iron tools and seed grain and the accumulated material of lives being lifted out of one world and carried toward another. The noise is enormous. Livestock in distress, children crying, men arguing about weight and balance, and the particular geometry of how much hope a hull can hold before it becomes something else. Women stand at the water's edge and look west, and what they are looking at is not yet a destination. It is still only a story told by a large, red-haired man who has every reason to make it sound better than it is. His name is Erik Thorvaldsson. Erik the Red, they call him, for the color of his hair and perhaps for the color of his temper, which is considerable. 3 years earlier, in 982 CE, he is sentenced to exile from Iceland for the crime of killing his neighbors, not one neighbor, but several, in the escalating fashion of Norse grievance, where each act of violence requires an answering act of violence, until the arithmetic becomes unsustainable, and the community decides that the man at the center of the equation must simply be removed from it. Erik is removed. He sails west into waters that most sensible people regard as the outer boundary of the habitable world, and he spends 3 years exploring a coastline that is vast and cold and genuinely, in places, beautiful. And when his exile is complete, he returns to Iceland and begins to talk. What he says is this: there is land to the west. Good land. Greenland. The sagas record his reasoning with something close to admiration, which is itself instructive. The saga writers are not naive. They understand what he is doing. They note, almost approvingly, that he calls the place Greenland because men would be more willing to go there if the land had a good name. This is not recorded as a scandal. It is recorded as a demonstration of competence. Here is a man who understands how the world actually works, who grasps that reality is partly a negotiation, and that the terms of the negotiation are set by whoever speaks first and most persuasively. Erik the Red is, before he is anything else, a salesman, and standing on that Icelandic coastline in 985 CE, surrounded by 25 ships and their cargo of human ambition, he is at the height of his powers. The crossing takes weeks, and it takes 11 ships, not in the sense that 11 ships make it, and the others turn back, in the sense that of 25 ships that leave Iceland, 14 arrive in Greenland, 11 are lost to storm, to ice, to the simple merciless arithmetic of the North Atlantic, in the age before weather forecasting and the age before rescue. The sagas mention this. They do not dwell on it. But the narration must, because those 11 ships are not a footnote. They are the first toll this place extracts, and the people who make landfall carry the weight of that toll in their bodies, in the way that survivors always carry the weight of the ones who did not survive. Not as grief exactly, not yet, but as a kind of altered gravity, a new understanding of what has been wagered and what has already been lost. What they find when they arrive is not paradise, but it is real, and in the summer of 985 CE, real is enough. The fjords of southwestern Greenland are, in this moment, genuinely hospitable. The medieval warm period is at its height, and this is no small thing. Temperatures across the North Atlantic are running perhaps a degree or two warmer than what will come later, and a degree or two in this latitude is the difference between possible and impossible. The grass is thin, but it is there. The summers are short, but they are genuine summers, with light that seems to last forever. The sun barely touching the horizon before it rises again, filling the fjords with a quality of illumination that the settlers have never seen before. Golden and horizontal and endless, turning the water to hammered bronze, making even the stone look warm. The sea is cold, but it is full. Seal and walrus and the great whales moving through the deep channels. Caribou on the uplands. Arctic char in the rivers, so thick in the spawning runs that you can nearly walk across them. Erik chooses his farm site with the eye of a man who has spent 3 years looking. He calls it Brattolid, steep slope, and it sits at the head of a fjord in what will become known as the Eastern Settlement, sheltered from the worst of the wind, south-facing, catching whatever warmth the sun offers. He builds there. Others build nearby. The settlement takes shape with the organic momentum of people who have committed everything and therefore cannot afford to stop moving forward, because stopping means looking back, and looking back means accounting for the 11 ships. The western settlement grows up separately, several hundred miles up the coast, smaller and more exposed and always slightly more precarious than its southern counterpart. Between the two communities, in time, several thousand people will make their lives. The sagas speak of perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 souls at the colony's height, and even if the number is approximate, the civilization it implies is real. This is not a camp. This is not a temporary outpost. This is a declaration that Norse people, Norse ways, Norse God can be carried to the uttermost rim of the earth and planted there like a flag, and that they will hold. The economy that sustains them is remarkable in its ingenuity and precarious in its dependencies, and the narration must hold both of those truths at once without flinching from either. Greenland produces two things that the medieval world desperately wants: walrus ivory and polar bear pelts. The ivory comes from the enormous walrus herds that crowd the northern hunting grounds, and it is worked into the luxury goods, chess pieces, reliquary handles, the decorative elements of power that flow through European markets with the same status that elephant ivory once carried and will again carry when the African trade reopens. The polar bears are taken alive when possible, young ones especially, cubs that can survive the long voyage south and arrive at European courts as living spectacles, gifts worthy of kings. The Archbishop of Nidaros receives polar bears. The King of Norway receives polar bears. The colony sends them south as tribute and as currency, and in return it receives the things that Greenland will never produce on its own: iron, timber, grain, the material infrastructure of a civilization that cannot be manufactured from ice and stone. It is a fragile arrangement, and everyone involved understands this at some level. The way people understand things they prefer not to examine directly. The ships must come. The ships must always come. Without them, the iron rusts away and is not replaced. The timber rots and cannot be renewed from local forests, because there are no local forests. Only the scrub willow and dwarf birch that line the lower valleys, too small and too sparse to build anything larger than a fence post. The colony's relationship with Norway and with the Church in Rome is not merely political or spiritual. It is metabolic. They require it, the way a body requires blood. But in these early generations, the ships do come, and the colony grows. Churches rise from the stone that this land offers in abundance, the one material it has in genuine surplus. Garda, in the eastern settlement, becomes the seat of a bishop and the site of a cathedral that is, by any measure, an astonishing thing to find at the edge of the known world. Stone walls, a bell tower, a nave that can hold a genuine congregation. The dead are buried in consecrated ground beside it, their hands folded across their chests, their faces turned toward a Jerusalem they will never see, because the church requires a specific orientation of burial, and the settlers of Greenland comply with that requirement regardless of the labor it costs them in this rocky, increasingly frost-hardened soil. They are Norse. They are Christian. They are here. These are not three separate facts. They are one fact, and it is the central fact of their existence, the thing that holds them together across the vast distances of the North Atlantic and the vast distances between the two settlements and the vast, uncrossable distance between what this place is and what they need it to be. Erik the Red himself does not live to see the full flowering of what he has planted, but he lives long enough to see it become undeniable, which is more than most dreamers are given. His wife, Jothild, converts to Christianity. The new faith is moving through the Norse world with the same unstoppable momentum that all new faiths carry in their early generations. And she builds a small church at Brattahlid, the first Christian structure in the Western Hemisphere. a tiny thing of stone and turf that nevertheless represents an enormous shift in the colony's spiritual center of one, gravity, Erik grumbles. This is recorded. He is a man of the old ways, of Odin and Thor, and the understanding the world is held together by force and cunning rather than by grace. And the new god strikes him as insufficiently practical for a man in his situation. But Jodhild is persuasive, and Erik is, in the end, buried in consecrated ground. His conversion accomplished over his objections, his body oriented toward Jerusalem, his red hair gone grey, and his enormous hands folded in the posture of a faith he accepted reluctantly. There is something in this detail that contains the whole colony in miniature. Here is a man who bent reality to his purposes, who renamed a frozen island and made people believe the name, who understood that the stories we tell about the world are as real as the world itself. And he dies in a story someone else is telling, in ground consecrated to a god he did not choose, having given his descendants a gift and a curse so thoroughly intertwined that they cannot be separate. D. The gift is this place. The curse is the name he gave it. Because the name is still working, even now. Even after the ships stop coming and the climate turns and the pastures shrink and everything he built begins its long, quiet return to silence. The name is still doing exactly what he designed it to do, making people believe that what they are looking at is something other than what it is. The grass is thin, but it is real. The light is extraordinary. The fjords are sheltered, and the sea is full, and the summer stretches on and on in that impossible golden way. And for now, for these first generations, in this particular window of warmth that they will mistake for a permanent condition, being alive in this place feels like enough. It is enough. It will not always be enough. It is enough, but the colony does not know that yet. It is still in the part of the story where the bet feels like wisdom, where the commitment feels like strength, where the name on the map feels like a promise rather than a warning. The churches are new. The graves are few. The ships are still coming. Erik the Red is in the ground, and the name he gave this place is still on the maps, still misleading travelers, still doing its work, still whispering to anyone who looks westward that the cold can be renamed, that the ice is negotiable, that a man with enough conviction can call a thing what he needs it to be and make the world agree. The world, for now, agrees. The bell rings first, before any image resolves, before the eye finds its footing in the grey light of a Greenland morning. There is only the bell, a single clear tone moving out across still water, crossing the fjord in the cold air, arriving at the far shore diminished but intact. It is a European sound. It belongs to a different latitude, a different century of human experience, a different negotiation with the earth. And yet here it is, ringing. Here it is, insisting. Stand at Garda and look. Do not explain it yet. Do not reach for context or chronology. Simply stand at the episcopal seat of Norse Greenland, the administrative and spiritual center of everything Erik's lie made possible, and let the scale of what human beings have built here arrive on its own terms. The way a cathedral is supposed to arrive. Slowly, with weight, with the full intention of making you feel small before it. The dressed stone rises from the fjordside ground in courses so precise, so deliberate, so entirely indifferent to the landscape around them that the eye takes a moment to accept what it is seeing. This is not a rough shelter. This is not a rough shelter. This is not a sod house thrown up against the wind by people grateful for any protection the earth will offer. This is a cathedral. Its nave is long enough to hold several hundred souls standing shoulder to shoulder in their best wool, their breath rising in visible clouds toward a ceiling vaulted in stone, their faces turned toward an altar that faces east, always toward Jerusalem, always toward a center of the world that is very far away, The bishop's residence stands adjacent. Stone upon stone, room upon room, a structure of some comfort and considerable authority. The tithe barn looms behind it all, capacious and practical, and quietly threatening in the way that all instruments of institutional demand are threatening, built not for the people who fill it, but for the power that empties it. This is the architecture of identity, not survival. Identity. And this is where Erik's lie completes itself. The founding fiction of Greenland as a habitable European place, the name chosen to seduce, the green coast offered as evidence, the whole magnificent salesmanship of a man who needed settlers and knew how to get them, did not remain a fiction. It was quarried, it was dressed, it was mortared and raised and consecrated and rung with bells. The lie became stone. The lie became a diocese. The lie became the most expensive and least practical building project in the history of human settlement at the edge of the world. And it became these things because the people who built it needed it to be true more than they needed it to be wise. There are 16 churches across the 2 settlements of Norse Greenland. 16. In a colony that at its height holds perhaps 5,000 souls spread across hundreds of miles of coastline, the Norse build 16 stone churches because a people who are truly Norse are a people who worship in stone, who mark their dead in consecrated ground, who organize their calendar around feast days and fast days and the long liturgical year that connects them to a Christendom they can no longer reach by ship without difficulty, and cannot reach at all in the worst of the ice years. The churches are not incidental to the colony's identity. They are the colony's identity, made physical, made permanent, made into something that can be pointed to and said, "Here, we are here, we are this." The farms spread out from the fjords in the Scandinavian pattern, longhouses, byres attached so that the body heat of the cattle warms the living quarters in winter. The whole arrangement, a direct transplant from Norway, from Iceland, from the agricultural tradition of a people who have been farming this way for generations and who farm this way here, because this is how Norse people farm. Cattle graze on pasture that is thin in the good years and heartbreaking in the bad ones. Sheep work the hillsides. Goats pick at whatever the sheep leave behind. The animals are smaller here than their Scandinavian counterparts, smaller and more desperate, reduced by generations of inadequate forage to a kind of livestock that would be unrecognizable to the farmers of the mainland. But they are Norse animals, raised in the Norse fashion, and their presence on this landscape is itself a form of argument. We are not hunters, we are farmers. We are not the people of this place. We are Norse people in this place, and the distinction is everything. The economic engine that makes all of it possible is walrus ivory. The Norse hunters, and they do hunt, at least this, travel north along the Greenland coast in organized expeditions, pushing into waters that would be extraordinary even by the standards of experienced Arctic navigators. And they return with ivory and rope made from walrus hide and the pelts of polar bears and the occasional live animal for the menageries of European courts. This trade is the colony's connection to the world it came from. As long as European markets want what Greenland produces, the supply ships come. As long as the supply ships come, the colony can import the iron it cannot smelt, the timber it cannot cut, the grain it cannot grow in sufficient quantities, the goods of a civilization that require civilization to produce. The walrus ivory trade is not merely commerce. It is the proof of concept. The demonstration, renewed with every ship that arrives and every ship that departs, that Greenland is a viable European outpost, rather than an anomaly waiting to be corrected by history. But the trade is a dependency, and dependencies are fragile in direct proportion to how essential they become. The colony cannot feed itself on ivory. It cannot clothe itself on the proceeds of the walrus hunt alone. It requires Europe in the way that a branch requires a tree, and the moment Europe begins to look elsewhere, the moment African elephant ivory floods the market through expanding trade routes, the moment Greenland's peculiar exports become less necessary, less valuable, less worth the cost of the voyage, the branch begins to die from the extremity inward. This moment is coming. The Norse of Greenland do not know it is coming. They build their tithe barn at Garda and fill it with the surplus of their agricultural labour and pay their ecclesiastical obligations to a church that needs them to remain a functioning European agricultural community. And the arrangement sustains itself through the sheer momentum of institutional expectation. Bishop Alf arrives in 1368 to tend this diocese. He is less a man than an institution made flesh, a representative of Rome's continued investment in the proposition that Greenland is a real place in the European sense, a place with souls to save and tithes to collect, and ecclesiastical records to maintain. His appointment is, in its way, a monument to the same refusal that built the cathedral. The refusal to acknowledge what is actually happening on this island, what the climate is doing, what the ice is saying, what the silence of the supply ships in the increasingly long intervals between visits is trying, in its impersonal way, to communicate. Rome dispatches a bishop to a diocese it can barely locate on a map. And the bishop goes, and the appointment is recorded, and the machinery of the church continues to turn. And in that turning is a kind of terrible comfort, the comfort of an institution so large and so old that it can maintain the fiction of normalcy long after normalcy has departed. The tithe barn at Garda must be kept in mind. It is worth returning to, worth holding in the eye as a structure and as a symbol simultaneously. It is built to store agricultural surplus. It is built on the assumption that there will be surplus, that the land will continue to produce beyond the colony's own needs, that the church's claim on that production will continue to be honored, that the arrangement between this community and the institution that legitimizes it will persist in the form in which it was established. When the surplus disappears, and it will disappear slowly, as the pasture shrinks and the growing season contracts and the cattle produce less and the sheep find less to eat on the browning hillsides. The barn will not disappear with it. The demand will not disappear with it. The demand will not disappear with it. The church will continue to expect what the land can no longer provide, and the settlers will continue to attempt to provide it, because to stop providing it would be to admit something that the entire architecture of their civilization is designed to prevent them from admitting. Consider the labor. This is where the chapter asks its hardest question, and it asks it quietly, without accusation. Because these are not foolish people. They are not blind. They are not incapable of reason. They are simply people for whom identity has become indistinguishable from existence. And so the labor of maintaining identity has become indistinguishable from existence. And so the labor of maintaining identity feels identical to the labor of survival. Every hour spent cutting and dressing and mortaring cathedral stone is an hour not spent building boats suited to Arctic hunting. Every season of effort poured into the tithe barn is a season not spent developing the smokehouses and the ice fishing infrastructure and the seal hunting techniques that could feed a community through the darkest and coldest of years. Every grave dug in consecrated ground. And the permafrost makes every grave an enormous labor. The earth resisting the dead with the same indifference it shows to the living is a declaration that these people will be buried as Christians in Christian earth, even if the digging of that grave costs more than the colony can reasonably afford. They are spending themselves on themselves, and it is magnificent, and it is fatal. The bell rings again across the fjord. The sound travels the way sound travels on still mornings over cold water, farther than seems possible, cleaner than seems fair, arriving at distances that the bell's makers could not have anticipated when they cast it in some European foundry and sent it west on a ship that was already a long way from home. The congregation files into the cathedral. Their breath rises. The altar faces east. The liturgy proceeds in Latin, the language of a civilization that is very far away and growing, in some essential sense that no one here can yet name, farther by the year, and somewhere beyond the ridgeline, invisible to the worshippers, inaudible to anyone inside those stone walls, moving through a landscape that the Norse see only as an obstacle and the Inuit read like a text, An Inuit hunter is on the ice. The kajak moves beneath him with a precision that is itself a kind of language, a conversation between a human body and an Arctic sea, carried on in the vocabulary of balance and weight and the reading of water and ice that takes a lifetime to acquire. He is warm in his layered skins. He is fed. He is at home in the only sense that matters in the end, not the home of memory or myth or the story a people tell themselves about who they are, but the home of competence, the home of a body that knows how to be alive in the place where it actually is. The bell and the quahak occupy the same frozen world. The bell rings its clear European note into the Arctic air. The kujak moves across the ice without a sound. They might as well be on different planets. Sometime in the 12th or 13th century, the precise dating is contested, the sources are fragmentary, and the Inuit themselves left no written record of this encounter. The Thule people arrive in Greenland from the north and west. They do not arrive like an army. They do not arrive like a storm. They arrive the way the seasons arrive, gradually and then undeniably, moving along the coastline with the quiet efficiency of a culture that has spent centuries calibrating itself to exactly this world, and they find, to their probable surprise, that the island they are moving into is already partially occupied. The Norse call them skraelings. The word means something close to wretches, or barbarians, or perhaps simply lesser beings. The Norse are not precise in their contempt. The word tells us everything about how the Norse experienced this encounter and nothing, not a single syllable, about what the Inuit think of the large, pale, cattle-herding strangers who have built stone buildings in the southern fjords and seem to believe that this is a reasonable way to live. The Thule people have come from the west, out of what is now Arctic Canada, following the same routes that animals follow, which is to say, the routes that food follows, which is to say, the only routes that matter. They are not wanderers in any aimless sense. They are precision travelers, moving with intention across a landscape that most of the world does not know exists, and they carry with them a civilization so thoroughly adapted to the Arctic that it functions less like a culture and more like a biological system. Each element connected to every other element, each tool and technique and social arrangement evolved in response to a specific and unquote, forgiving set of demands. They are not surviving the Arctic. They are living inside it, the way a fish lives inside water, not despite the medium but through it, and with it, and because of it. Consider the toggling harpoon, because it is worth considering carefully. The Norse have hunting weapons. They have spears and bows and the accumulated technology of a warrior culture. But the toggling harpoon is something of a different order entirely. It is not merely a weapon, but an argument, a proof rendered in bone and sinew that a people have thought longer and harder about a single problem than most civilizations think about anything. The harpoon head is designed to toggle, to turn perpendicular inside the body of the animal after it strikes, so that the harder the seal pulls away, the more firmly the head locks inside the wound. The line attached to the harpoon does not simply hold the animal, it communicates with it, transmitting the seal's movement back through the water and the ice to the hunter's hands. A conversation conducted in tension and resistance, and the hunter waits at the aglue, the breathing hole, sometimes for hours, perfectly still, reading the subtle disturbance of the water below, knowing that the seal must breathe, that the Arctic itself will deliver the animal to the surface if the hunter is patient enough to become part of the silence. This is not primitive technology. This is engineering. This is the result of generations of observation and refinement, and the kind of accumulated knowledge that only comes from a people who have decided that this place is worth understanding completely. The kajak is the same kind of argument made in a different medium. It is built from driftwood and bone and seal skin stretched taut over a frame so precisely dimensioned that each boat is effectively custom-made for the body of the man who will paddle it, fitted to his reach and his weight and the particular geometry of his torso. When it moves across the water, it is nearly silent. It sits so low that from a distance it seems less like a vessel and more like a thought, a human intention moving across the surface of a world that has not consented to be crossed. It can be rolled upright after a capsize, the paddler recovering from beneath the water in a motion so practiced it seems instinctive. Though nothing about it is instinctive, everything about it has been learned and taught and learned again. The Norse have boats too, and fine ones. The longboat is one of the great engineering achievements of the medieval world. But the longboat is built for the North Atlantic, for open water and long passages and the carrying of cargo and men. It is not built for hunting among ice floes in shallow coastal water. In the conditions that Greenland is increasingly presenting to the 14th century, the longboat is becoming, by degrees, the wrong answer to the question being asked. And then there is the clothing. This detail must be held carefully, turned over slowly, because it will matter more than almost anything else in the story of what happens next. The Thule people dress in layers, seal skin against the body, caribou skin over that, the fur oriented in alternating directions so that the air trapped between layers becomes insulation, becomes warmth, becomes a portable climate carried on the body itself. The outer garments are cut and sewn with a precision that a European tailor would recognize as craftsmanship, though the European tailor would not have the materials or the knowledge to replicate it. The stitching is nearly waterproof. The hood is designed to be worn in multiple configurations, depending on conditions, open or closed, or partially closed, managing the body's heat output with a sophistication that no wool garment, however heavy, however layered, can approach. A person wearing Thule clothing in an Arctic winter is warm, not tolerably warm, not survivably warm, warm in the way that a person in their own home by their own fire is warm, genuinely, sustainably, functionally warm. The Norse in their wool and their woven cloaks are cold. They are always increasingly cold. The two peoples meet. Of course they meet. An island is not a large enough stage to keep two civilizations from finding each other, and the archaeological record preserves the evidence of their encounters in the patient, unsentimental language of objects. Norse artifacts turn up in Inuit middens, pieces of chainmail, fragments of barrel staves, bits of woven cloth worked into Inuit tools or simply kept as curiosities, the material residue of a culture that the Inuit examine with the same practical intelligence they bring to everything else. And in Norse contexts, objects appear that carry the unmistakable influence of Inuit craft. A carving here, a technique there, the ghost of a different way of thinking about the relationship between a human body and the world it inhabits. They traded. They watched each other across the distance that contempt creates and curiosity crosses. There were almost certainly exchanges that the written record does not capture. Moments of transaction and observation and the tentative, guarded communication of two peoples who share a geography and nothing else they can immediately name. There was violence too. The sagas mention skirmishes. The Norse accounts describe the Skrælings as dangerous, unpredictable, given to sudden attack, which is the way a frightened people describes a people it cannot understand. The Inuit accounts do not exist in written form, but the archaeology suggests a relationship more complex than simple hostility, a long and ambiguous adjacency that contains within it the entire spectrum of human possibility, from trade to conflict to something that might, under different circumstances, have become something more. Into this world comes Ivar Bardason, a Norwegian cleric dispatched on church business sometime around 1341, moving through Greenland on a mission of ecclesiastical administration with the focused purposefulness of a man who knows exactly what he is looking for and has no particular interest in anything else. He is a careful observer in the narrow sense. He notices, he records, he produces a written account that becomes one of the primary documents of this period. He travels to the Western settlement, and he writes down what he finds there, and what he finds there will be discussed in the chapter that follows this one. But what matters here is what Bardason sees on his journey. what he notices and what he does not notice, because the gap between those two things is the gap in which the Norse colony will eventually disappear. Bardason sees the Inuit. He cannot avoid seeing them. He records their presence with the same tone he might use to record the presence of a difficult weather system, something to be noted, to be navigated around, to be reported to authorities who will determine the appropriate response. He does not record curiosity about how they eat. He does not record any interest in how they dress, or how they hunt, or how they move across the ice in those extraordinary low boats that seem to be made of the water itself. He is a literate man in an illiterate age, a representative of the most sophisticated institutional structure in the Western world. And he moves through a landscape full of answers to questions his civilization is dying from asking, and he writes none of them down. He is not stupid. He is not cruel, or not particularly cruel. He is simply a man who already knows what matters, and what matters is the church and the colony, and the proper administration of both. And the people living successfully in the cold are not part of that accounting. He stands, this careful cleric, with his vellum and his ink and his institutional certainties, as the perfect representative of everything the Norse colony is and everything it cannot become. He is observant and incurious. He is present and absent simultaneously. He sees the Inuit the way a man sees furniture in a room he is passing through, as features of the environment rather than as sources of knowledge, as obstacles or curiosities rather than as teachers. And the Norse colony, which has produced him and sent him and will receive his reports and act on them, shares his epistemology completely. The Inuit are not people from whom one learns. They are Skraelings, the lesser beings at the edge of the world, the ones without churches or cattle or the saving grace of Christian civilization. That they are alive and thriving in conditions that are beginning to kill their neighbors is not, in the Norse accounting, a fact of any particular significance. This is the thing that must be understood, and it must be understood not with contempt but with something closer to awe. The awe one feels in the presence of a very great and very terrible consistency. The Norse are not failing to notice the Inuit because they are blind. They are failing to notice them because noticing, truly noticing, would require a kind of cognitive surrender that the entire weight of their civilization is designed to prevent. To look at a man in sealskin clothing and think, I should dress like that, is not a simple thought. It is a catastrophic thought. It is a thought that contains within it the dissolution of everything that makes you yourself, your identity, your hierarchy, your relationship to God and to history, and to the story you tell about why you are here and what you are doing and what it means that you have come so far to be so cold. The Norse have not come to the edge of the world to become something else. They have come to remain themselves, to prove that Norse identity is portable, durable, exportable to any latitude. To learn from the Skraelings is to admit that the project has failed, that the world at this latitude belongs to a different kind of human being, and that is not a thought that a civilization built on the premise of its own superiority can think and survive as itself. So the knowledge sits next door, patient and demonstrated and freely available, offered not in words, but in the daily evidence of a people who are warm when their neighbors are cold, fed when their neighbors are hungry, mobile when their neighbors are trapped, alive in a place where their neighbors are beginning, by degrees so slow they can almost be mistaken for something else. To die, the Inuit move through the landscape with the ease of long belonging. They hunt in weather that keeps the Norse indoors. They cross water that the Norse cannot cross. Their children grow up knowing things, in their hands, in their bodies, in the accumulated physical intelligence, of a culture that has never had the luxury of ignoring the world as it actually is, that the Norse children in the stone farmhouses will never know. And the two peoples exist in this proximity, this terrible proximity, this generations, trading sometimes, watching always, each one a mirror in which the other might have seen something essential about the nature of survival, about the difference between a civilization that serves its people and a civilization that demands its people serve it. We are left with one of the most painful images in the history of human settlement. Two peoples sharing an island, one of them holding the key to survival, and the other watching with a mixture of contempt and incomprehension that masks, perhaps, a terror they cannot name. The Norse see, at some level they must see, that the Inuit are not struggling. They see the full seal-hide boats moving through water choked with ice. They see the clothing that sheds wind and holds heat against the body like a second skin. They see children playing in temperatures that send Norse adults indoors to crouch over fires that consume the scarce timber they cannot replace. And they turn away, not from cowardice. The Norse are not cowards, but from something more deeply and more tragically human than cowardice. They turn away from survival because survival, on these terms, is not survival. It is transformation. It is the end of the story they have been telling about themselves since Erik the Red first looked at these fjords and decided to call them home. The Inuit will still be in Greenland when the last Norse fire goes out. They are still there today. The question of why the Norse could not learn from them is not a question about intelligence or even about culture in the abstract. It is a question about the cost of identity, about what a people will sacrifice to remain themselves. The answer, written in abandoned stone in empty farmhouses and the long silence that follows the last recorded wedding at Valsey Church, is this: everything. A people will sacrifice everything. They will sacrifice warmth and food and the future and the lives of their children, and they will do it with dignity, and they will do it with faith, and they will do it in the full presence of an alternative they have chosen every single day not to take. The Thule people move through the cold with the confidence of a civilization that has made its peace with the world as it is. The Norse hold the world as it was, or as they need it to be, or as God and history and the weight of everything they have carried to this frozen place require it to remain. One of these is a way of living. The other is a way of ending. And on this island, in this cold, the difference between them is becoming, with every passing winter, impossible to ignore and impossible to act upon, and that impossibility is the whole of the tragedy, and it is nearly complete. The cold does not announce itself. There is no morning when the people of the Eastern settlement wake to find a proclamation nailed to the cathedral door at Garda, declaring that the medieval warm period has ended, that the conditions which made their settlement marginally viable are now in permanent recession, that the terms of the agreement between this land and these people have been quietly, irrevocably altered. The cold comes the way all the most dangerous things come, gradually, incrementally, in ways that are easy to explain away year by year, even as they accumulate into catastrophe. Each bad summer is slightly worse than the last. Each late ice breakup is slightly later. Each failed harvest is slightly more complete than the one before it. The people of the Eastern settlement are not stupid. They are not blind. They can feel the difference between one decade and the next, can feel it in their hands and in their animals, and in the quality of the light in September, which seems to carry less warmth than it once did, seems to lean toward darkness a little sooner, seems to be in a hurry to be done with them. They feel all of this. They explain it away. They have been explaining it away for so long that explanation has become a kind of second faith, practiced alongside the first one, equally sincere, equally unable to save them. Around 1300, what the scientists will one day call the Little Ice Age begins its slow installation across the North Atlantic. The phrase itself is misleading. It suggests something finite, something bounded, a season that will eventually turn. What it actually describes is a centuries-long rearrangement of the relationship between the northern world and the sun, a withdrawal of warmth that proceeds at a pace too gradual for any single human life to fully perceive, but too relentless for any human civilization to outrun. The growing season in Greenland shortens. Not dramatically, not all at once, but measurably. year by year, in ways that matter enormously to people who are already farming at the outermost edge of what farming can do. A week less of viable pasture, then another week, then the first frost arriving in August instead of September, which means the hay is not dry enough to store, which means the cattle go into winter underfed, which means they emerge in spring weakened and thin, which means the milk is less and the calves are fewer, which means the calculation that has always been precarious is now something worse than precarious, now something that does not quite add up no matter how many times you work the numbers. The sea ice thickens. This is the fact that carries the most consequence, though it will take years for that consequence to become undeniable. The pack ice that forms each winter along the Greenlandic coast begins extending further south, lingering later into spring, retreating more slowly and less completely than it once did. The sailing season, already brief, grows briefer. The passage from Norway to Greenland, already dangerous, grows more so, not because the storms are worse, not because the ships are worse, but because the window of navigable water is narrowing with each passing decade, shrinking like a doorway that is being slowly, quietly closed by a hand too large to see. The supply ships. Consider what the supply ships mean to these people, and you begin to understand what it means when they stop coming. They are not merely vessels. They are not merely the carriers of iron and timber and grain, though they carry all of those things, all of which the colony cannot produce for itself, all of which are essential to its physical survival. They are something more than that. They are the colony's connection to the world that gave the colony its meaning. Every ship that arrives from Norway is proof, tangible, floating, anchored in the fjord, proof that the Norse settlements of Greenland are known, are remembered, are considered worth the voyage. Every ship that arrives carries not just cargo, but confirmation. You are still worth the voyage. Every ship that arrives carries not just cargo, but confirmation. You are still part of something. The church knows you are here. The king knows you are here. The world you left behind has not forgotten you. You are not alone at the edge of everything. And so when the ships begin coming less frequently, the settlers do not receive only a material blow. They receive something that strikes deeper than material. Each ship that fails to arrive is a severing, another strand of the rope that ties these people to the civilization that gave their sacrifice its purpose. They stand on the shore in the brief summer and they watch the horizon, and the horizon gives them nothing. And they turn back to their farms and their churches, and they do not speak of what the empty horizon means, because to speak of it would be to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge it would require them to ask questions they are not prepared to answer. What do you do when the institution that defines you can no longer reach you? You continue to behave as though it can. This is not denial in any simple sense. It is not stupidity. It is something more profound and more heartbreaking than either of those things. It is the behavior of people for whom identity and survival have always been understood as the same project, for whom to be Norse and to be alive have always meant the same thing, and who therefore cannot conceive of a version of survival that requires them to be less Norse, because that version of survival would to them constitute survival at all. They import fodder for cattle that the land can no longer sustain. They work longer hours for diminishing returns, measuring their effort in calves born and hay cut and milk drawn, holding to an agricultural ledger that is increasingly written in red, that has not balanced for years, that will never balance again. They continue the tithe. This is the detail that must be held carefully, turned slowly in the light, because it illuminates everything. The tithe to the Church of Rome. The annual payment in walrus ivory and polar bear pelts and whatever else the colony can gather, dispatched to an institution that is increasingly unable and increasingly unwilling to dispatch anything in return. The ships that carry the tithe outward are not the same ships that carry iron and timber inward, because those ships have mostly stopped coming. But somehow the tithe finds its way. across the narrowing sea lanes, across the thickening ice, across the widening silence between Greenland and the world. The settlers of the eastern settlement pay their dues to an institution that has functionally abandoned them, and they do not pay those dues with resentment. They pay them with something that looks from a distance almost like gratitude, because the tithe is not economics. It was never economics. It is identity. It is proof of belonging. It is a statement made in ivory and fur that these people remain European and Christian and Norse regardless of what the ice is doing, regardless of what the thermometer, had they such a thing, would tell them about the direction in which their world is moving. To stop paying the tithe would be to admit that the relationship has changed. To admit that the relationship has changed would be to admit that everything has changed. And everything changing means that the sacrifice of 4 centuries, the leaving of Norway, the crossing of the sea, the building of the farms and the churches and the lives, was not a declaration, but a mistake. They cannot afford to believe it was a mistake, so they pay the tithe, and in paying it they purchase, at enormous cost, the consolation of continuity. Move through this same landscape at the same moment, and you find another people who are not paying any tithes at all. The Inuit, the Thule people, whom the Norse call Skraelings, a word that carries contempt the way a stone carries cold, are not suffering. This is the quiet devastation at the center of this chapter. The fact that sits beneath everything else like bedrock. The conditions that the Norse experience only as deprivation, the Inuit experience as simply the world, as the world they have always known, as the world they have built their entire civilization to inhabit with grace and intelligence and extraordinary skill. The same ice that is strangling the Norse shipping lanes is the surface on which the Inuit hunt. The same cold that is killing the Norse cattle is the cold for which Inuit clothing has been designed with a precision that represents thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. Layered seal and caribou skin that traps warmth against the body with an efficiency that Norse wool, however thick, however sincerely worn, cannot approach. They move through the same fjords. They read the ice the way the Norse read scripture, for meaning, for guidance, for the information that will determine whether this day ends in sustenance or in death. They hunt seal through the ice with toppling harpoons that are not improvised but engineered, the product of a tradition of technical refinement as sophisticated in its own terms as anything the cathedral builders of Europe have achieved in stone. They paddle kajate, those narrow, skin-covered vessels of such elegant hydrodynamic intelligence, through water that would kill a Norse sailor in minutes, moving through the freezing sea with a confidence born of complete adaptation, of a relationship with this environment so thorough and so long that the word adaptation barely captures it. They are not adapting to this world. They are this world, made human, moving across its surface with the ease of something that belongs. The Norse can see them. The two peoples are not separated by vast distances or impenetrable barriers. They make contact, sometimes peacefully, trading, watching each other with the careful attention that proximity and mutual incomprehension produce, sometimes violently, in encounters that leave dead on both sides and resentment that outlasts the specific grievance, but always in proximity, always close enough to observe. The knowledge of how to survive in Greenland is not hidden. It is not secret. It is demonstrated daily by neighbors, by people who are visibly, undeniably thriving in the conditions that are visibly, undeniably killing the Norse. The Norse watch, they do not learn. To learn would require a kind of intellectual humility that is, for these people, indistinguishable from cultural annihilation. To adopt the harpoon is to admit that the harpoon is better than what you have. To wear the sealskin is to admit that the sealskin is better than the wool. To learn to read the ice is to admit that the ice is the text that matters, rather than the text that arrived on the supply ships from a world that is no longer sending supply ships. Each act of learning from the Inuit would be, for the Norse settler, a small death of the self, a concession that the identity they have carried to this place the identity that is the entire justification for their presence here, is not sufficient for this place, is not adequate to this cold, is not, finally, the most important thing. And so, the most important thing becomes the thing that kills them. The winters deepen. The pastures shrink. The cattle grow thinner and fewer. The churches stand, cold now, colder than they were, their stone walls conducting the Arctic air inward with an efficiency that was not a problem when there was enough fuel to counter it. But that is a problem now that the driftwood is less, and the peat is harder to cut, and the labor of simply staying warm is consuming a larger and larger portion of every day, every season, every life. The bishop's chair at Gardar is increasingly empty. The supply ships are increasingly absent. The horizon that the settlers watch from their shores gives them increasingly nothing, and the nothing accumulates, and the settlers tighten their grip on what they have and who they are, and the grip itself becomes a kind of slow strangulation. This is what slow suffocation looks like from the outside. It looks like faithfulness. It looks like endurance. It looks like a people holding to their values under pressure, maintaining their identity against the forces that would dissolve it, refusing to become something lesser, something unrecognizable, something that their ancestors would not know. From the inside, it feels like dignity. It feels like the only possible response to an impossible situation. It feels like what you do when you have no choice. But there is a choice. There is always a choice. The Inuit are the choice, moving through the same fjords, hunting the same seals, thriving in the same cold, demonstrating every single day that this land is not inherently unsurvivable, that it is only unsurvivable on Norse terms, only deadly to people who insist on living here as though they were somewhere else. The cold that kills the Norse settlements is not cold alone. It is cold combined with a refusal to respond to cold on cold's own terms, cold amplified by the theological and cultural conviction that the correct response to a changing world is to hold more tightly to the world that is changing, to grip harder what is slipping, to pay the tithe more faithfully to the institution that has stopped sending ships, to bury the dead in consecrated ground even when the ground is iron with frost, and the digging takes days, to maintain the stone churches, even as the stone churches are becoming the most expensive and least practical buildings that human beings have ever constructed in any climate, at any time. The cold is the condition. The choice is the tragedy. And we watch the temperature drop on the charts. We see it in the ice cores, in the pollen records, in the slow southward creep of the pack ice across the centuries. And we understand that what we are watching is not a natural disaster. Natural disasters require only bad luck. What we are watching requires something more, something that only a civilization can provide. A civilization choosing, at every decision point, the option that leads toward extinction rather than the option that leads toward survival, choosing it faithfully, choosing it together, choosing it with complete sincerity and with the full weight of everything they believe themselves to be. The cold is real. The cold is coming. The cold has been coming for 100 years, and it will come for 100 more. But it is not the cold that makes this a tragedy. It is the people standing in it, watching it arrive, and choosing, again and again and again, to remain exactly who they are. In 1368, a man named Alf is appointed Bishop of Gardar. Let that sit for a moment. Bishop of Gardar, Diocese of Greenland, a title conferred with all the weight and ceremony of the medieval church, inscribed in a register in Rome by a careful hand that has almost certainly never seen the place the title describes, may never have spoken to anyone who has, and is working from maps that are partly conjecture, and partly wishful thinking, and partly the accumulated geographical errors of 2 centuries of imprecise reporting. The appointment is real. The diocese is real, in the sense that it was established, named, and administered, on paper, for nearly 300 years. Whether Bishop Alf himself is ever real to Greenland, whether he ever sets foot on that dark shore, whether he ever looks out across the fjord at Garda and understands himself to have arrived, this the historical record cannot tell us. That silence is the point. It is not an accident of documentation. It is not a gap that better scholarship might fill. It is the shape of the colony's relationship with the civilization it belongs to, rendered in the most precise terms available. A man is sent or not sent, and no one on either end of the journey is entirely sure which. The church dispatches, the ocean intervenes. Greenland waits or doesn't wait, because waiting implies an expectation of arrival, and by 1368, the Eastern settlement has been learning for decades, not to expect too much from the world beyond the ice. The Western settlement is already gone. It has been gone for a generation, emptied sometime around 1341 when Ivar Bardason sailed up the fjord and found a livestock wandering and the houses standing and the people simply absent, vanished into a silence so complete it offers no explanation and asks for none. The Eastern settlement knows this. The people who remain in the sheltered farms along the southwestern coast know that the other half of their world has stopped existing, and they carry that knowledge the way people carry all unbearable knowledge, carefully, in the part of the mind that does not speak it aloud, in the space between what is acknowledged and what is understood. And yet the church continues. This is what institutions do. This is perhaps what institutions are for. To continue in the face of evidence that continuation is difficult. To maintain the forms and procedures and hierarchies through which a civilization understands itself to be a civilization, even when the ground beneath those forms is shifting, even when the evidence of the senses argues for a different course. In Rome, the Diocese of Garda remains on the register. In the ecclesiastical geography of the medieval world, Greenland is a real place with real Christian souls who require and deserve the full machinery of pastoral care. A diocese, once established, must be administered. A bishop must be appointed. The appointment of Alf in 1368 is not cynicism. It is not indifference dressed in the language of duty. It is something more complicated and in some ways more troubling than either of those things. It is genuine belief, genuinely misapplied. It is an institution doing exactly what it was designed to do, in a situation its design never anticipated and cannot accommodate. Think of what the church actually means to Norse Greenland, not in the abstract, not as theology, but as the connective tissue of daily life in a place where connective tissue is always scarce. The church is the colony's primary institutional tether to Europe. It is the mechanism by which Greenland is legible to the wider world. A functioning diocese means these are real Christian souls on a real Christian map, not pagans on the periphery, but communicants, members of the body of the church, people whose lives and deaths and marriages and sins are recorded and matter and are known. Without the church, Greenland is simply a cold place where some Norse people live and die without consequence. With it, Greenland is a place that exists in the imagination of civilization, that has a name and an address in the spiritual geography of the medieval world, that can send a letter to Rome and receive one back, or at least believe that it can, which for most practical purposes amounts to the same thing. The churches themselves, the stone churches that rise from the Greenlandic turf with such improbable permanence, are not merely places of worship. They are arguments. They are the settlers making a claim in the most durable material available, that this is a Christian land, that what happens here is of consequence, that the people buried in this consecrated ground are not forgotten by God or by the civilization that produced them. Every stone placed on another stone is an act of insistence, every grave dug in the frozen earth. And by the 14th century, digging graves in Greenland is an act of enormous labor. The permafrost resisting the shovel with something that feels almost like intention is a declaration that these people will be buried properly, in the proper orientation, facing the proper direction, observed by the proper rites, regardless of the cost. And then there is the tithe barn at Garda. It stands at the center of the episcopal estate. This barn, built in the colony's confident middle years when the walrus ivory was flowing and the supply ships were coming with some regularity, and the future felt, if not exactly secure, then at least continuous. It is built to hold surplus. It is built on the assumption of abundance, of harvests that overflow, of tithes that require storage, of a community producing more than it consumes and setting aside the excess for the church that legitimizes its existence. The barn is the colony's confidence made material. It is the settlers saying, in timber and stone, "We are here, we are established, we have enough to give away." In 1368, the barn is still standing. The structure endures. But what it holds has changed in ways that no inventory can fully capture, because what has changed is not merely quantity but meaning. The barn was built to receive the overflow of a thriving settlement. What it receives now, if it receives anything at all, is the offering of a community that is tithing from its last reserves, that is giving to the church, not from surplus but from something closer to faith in its purest and most costly form. The cathedral echoes. The bishop's residence stands ready, or as ready as a building can stand that has been waiting, perhaps, for years between occupants. In the nave, the light comes in through windows that face the direction all Christian windows must face, indifferent to the wind direction, indifferent to the cold, oriented toward a Jerusalem that is as far from this fjord as anything in the human imagination. This is what Bishop Alf is appointed to tend. Whether he comes is a question the record will not answer. There is a possibility, and it is only a possibility, a shadow in the documentation, a perhaps, that he makes the journey. There is an equal possibility that he accepts the appointment in the way men sometimes accept appointments to impossible posts with genuine intention, with the full expectation of eventually departing. While the years pass and the departure keeps being deferred by weather, by logistics, by the slow accumulation of reasons why now is not the right time. The ships that go to Greenland are not many. The ships that return from Greenland are fewer. The crossing is long, and the sea ice is less predictable than it was a century ago, when the medieval warm period was still providing a margin of navigability that the climate is no longer willing to offer. A bishop appointed to Garda in 1368 might wait years for a ship willing to make the voyage. He might wait his entire episcopate. He might spend his tenure as Bishop of Garda in Bergen, or in Trondheim, or in some comfortable ecclesiastical residence in Scandinavia, administering his diocese at a distance, sending letters that may or may not arrive, receiving reports that may or may not be accurate, tending a flock he has never seen and will never see across a sea that is becoming less and less willing to be crossed. And in Rome, the register is kept. The entry for the Diocese of Garda is maintained. The appointment of Alf is noted. The bureaucratic life of the institution continues with a thoroughness and a care that the institution genuinely believes is the same thing as pastoral attention, because the institution has no other tools, and the tools it has it uses with complete sincerity. There is something in this that demands to be understood before it is judged. The Church's refusal to write Greenland off, its insistence on maintaining the diocese, on appointing bishops, on treating these distant souls as souls deserving of the full weight of ecclesiastical care, is not without a kind of nobility. It speaks to the depth of the original commitment, to the genuine belief that what was built here mattered, that the people who carried the faith to the uttermost rim of the known world were not to be abandoned simply because the logistics had become difficult. Difficult logistics are not, in the Church's long experience, a theological reason to withdraw. The faith has been carried to harder places than this. The faith has been maintained in worse conditions than these. A diocese is not dissolved because the supply ships are infrequent. A bishop is not recalled because the crossing is dangerous. These are the terms of the commitment that was made when the first church was consecrated in Greenland. And the Church, whatever its failures, is not an institution that unmakes its commitments lightly, but But nobility and wisdom are not the same thing. They are not even closely related. Nobility is the quality of the commitment. Wisdom is the quality of the judgment. A man can be genuinely, deeply, admirably committed to a course of action that is also genuinely, deeply, fatally wrong, and the depth of the commitment does not redeem the wrongness of the course. The Church in 1368 is committed to Greenland with something that deserves to be called genuine pastoral devotion. It is also operating on a picture of Greenland that is decades out of date, maintained by institutional momentum and theological principle rather than by any real understanding of what is happening on the ground in the eastern settlement. The appointment of Alf is an administrative act performed at a distance by an institution that has lost real contact with the place it is administering, and the distance is not merely geographical. It is the distance between what the Church's categories can describe and what is actually occurring, between the vocabulary of a thriving Christian diocese and the reality of a community contracting around its last resources, burning its last fuel, feeding its last cattle through winters that are longer and harder than any winter its grandparents knew. The Church's administrative categories have no word for what is happening to Greenland. There is no entry in the register for a diocese that is dying. There is no form for a flock that is dwindling, not through apostasy or heresy, but through the slow arithmetic of cold and scarcity, and a world that has become, degree by degree and year by year, less willing to sustain the particular way of life that the settlers have insisted on living. The Church can record a bishop's appointment. It can maintain a diocese's existence in the ledgers of ecclesiastical administration. It can send letters and receive letters and note the passage of years in careful Latin script. What it cannot do, what its entire institutional architecture is not designed to do, is look at the evidence of its own failing and change course. That is not what institutions are for. Institutions are for continuity. They are the mechanism by which a civilization persists across the discontinuities of individual human lives, and they do this by treating the forms and procedures of civilized life as more durable and more real than the circumstances that gave rise to them. The settlers of Greenland understand this. They have built their lives on exactly this principle. The Church that appoints a bishop to a dying diocese is doing precisely what the settlers do when they butcher the last of their cattle rather than learn to hunt, seal through the ice. It is choosing identity over adaptation. It is choosing the form over the function, the name over the thing the name describes, the record over the reality that the record was meant to capture. The register in Rome will survive when the last fire in the last hearth in the eastern settlement has gone cold. The entry for the Diocese of Garda will remain legible in the Vatican archives long after the last person who could have told you what Garda looked like in the morning light, what the fjords smelled like in summer, what the sound of the cathedral bell carried across the water on a clear day, long after the last person who held any of that in living memory has been gone for generations. The record outlasts the people. This is the final, most precise statement of what has gone wrong. Not that the people failed to survive. Survive is not guaranteed to anyone, and there is no shame in the failure of it, but that the record, the institution, the administrative machinery of belonging to a civilization outlasts the people that machinery was meant to serve. The Church will continue to have a Diocese of Garda long after there is no Garda. The appointment of Bishop Alf will remain in the register long after there is no one in Greenland who knows his name or cares about his title or has any use for a bishop or a diocese or the civilization these things represent. In 1368, a man named Alf is appointed Bishop of Garda. He may go, he may not go. The record does not say, and the record is all we have. And the record will be here long after the question has ceased to matter to anyone who is alive to ask it. The colony's institutional life and its biological life have finally, irreparably diverged. They will not converge again. Whatever happens next in the Eastern settlement, whatever the last years look like, whatever the last people do with their diminishing days, happens outside the frame of the Church's administrative vision in the space between appointments, in the silence between letters, in the cold that the register in Rome cannot feel, and does not record that the register in Rome cannot feel, and does not record and will never, in its long and careful life, acknowledge G. And then, into that silence, a wedding. On a Sunday in September 1408, in the stone church at Halsey in the eastern settlement of Norse Greenland, a man named Thorstein Olafsson marries a woman named Sigrid Bjornsdottir. The ceremony is conducted according to all the proper rites. There are witnesses. There is a congregation. Someone, afterward, sits down and writes it up. Not because the moment feels historic, not because anyone in that room senses they are standing at the edge of an ending, but because this is what communities do. They generate paperwork. They record their occasions. They send letters. The document makes its way to Iceland, where it is copied and kept, and centuries later, historians find it and understand it for what it is, the last confirmed record of a living Norse community in Greenland, the last proof that someone was still there, that the lights were still on. This is what breaks you if you let it, not the drama of it. The absence of drama. The letter does not read like a farewell. It reads like correspondence. There is no sense in the document that Thorstein Olafsson stands at the threshold of oblivion. No elegiac register, no intimation of catastrophe. He is a man who has married a woman, and the community has witnessed it. And now the community is writing it down because that is the ordinary, unremarkable, necessary thing that functioning communities do when they believe there will be someone to receive such letters, when they believe there is a future in which these details will matter to someone, when they believe, as all living people must, believe in order to go on living, that the world will continue past this Sunday, past this autumn, past this particular arrangement of candlelight and vows inside a stone church on the edge of a fjord at the edge of the known world. The church at Halsey is not a modest building. It is built to last. Its walls are thick stone, fitted with care, raised by hands that understood they were making something permanent. It stands on a small promontory above the fjord, and in September the light comes low and long across the water, and the mountains behind it hold the last of the summer's color. It is, by any measure, a beautiful place to be married. It is also, by any honest measure, a place that should not have a church this size, this solid, this expensive in human labor and intention. That stone could have been something else. That effort could have gone somewhere else, but it went here, into walls that would outlast everything, into a building that would still be standing when the people who built it had been gone for 600 years. This is the community that produces the Halsey letter, and the archaeology tells us with a precision that the letter itself cannot, what that community actually looks like in 1408. The bones tell us. The middens tell us. The settlement patterns tell us. These are people showing signs of dietary stress, less variety, more dependence on what the immediate land provides, less of the traded goods and imported provisions that once marked a community with connections to the wider world. They have retreated to their best farms, the ones closest to the remaining pasture, the ones with the most sheltered positions. The margins of the settlement have been abandoned. The outlying farms, the smaller holdings, the places where people lived when there were enough people to spread out. The community has contracted. It has pulled itself inward, toward its center, toward its best remaining resources, like a fire burning down to its last good wood. And at the center of that contracted, stressed, quietly diminishing community, on a Sunday in September, someone gets married. Hold that. Do not resolve it. The candles are lit inside the church, and outside the church, the evidence of a civilization in its final years is visible in every direction. These two things are not in contradiction. They are the same thing. The wedding is not denial in the simple, self-deceiving sense. It is something more considered, more deliberate, more devastating than that. These are people who know, on some level, what is happening to them. They have watched the Western settlement go quiet. They have felt the supply ships come less and less. They have watched the pasture shrink and the sea ice thicken and the winters deepen. They know, and they hold the ceremony anyway. They write the letter anyway. They send it somehow to Iceland, as if to say, we are still here. We are still Norse. We are still doing the things that Norse people do. Their witness, the wandering livestock that Ivar Bardason found in the western settlement 67 years before this wedding. Those cattle and sheep and goats moving through empty fields without shepherds, grazing on grass that no one was harvesting, living on in the absence of the people who had brought them there. Those animals are the eastern settlement's future, glimpsed early and at a distance. Bardason saw it. He wrote it down. He sailed away. And the eastern settlement, which received that report, which knew what the silence of the western settlement meant, continued. Continued farming. Continued churching. Continued being exactly what it had always been, with less and less material with which to do so. The animals outlasted the people in the west because the land did not stop providing. The land went on. The grass grew. The seals came up through the ice in their ancient rhythms. The Arctic continued to offer what it had always offered, to anyone willing to take it on its own terms. What was not there in the Western settlement was anyone willing to do that. And what is not there in the Eastern settlement on this Sunday in September 1408, as the vows are spoken and the witnesses sign their names, is any indication that the lesson has been received. The Inuit are still here. They are thriving as they have always thriven, because they have built their lives around what this land actually is, rather than what they wish it were. They are not far away. They have never been far away. The two peoples have moved in proximity for generations, sometimes trading, sometimes in conflict, always within sight of each other's fires. The knowledge of how to live in this place is not secret. It is demonstrated daily by people who have mastered it. The Norse of the Eastern settlement can see this. They choose, again, not to see it. They light the candles in the church, and they speak the vows, and they write the letter. And the choice they are making is the same choice their grandparents made, and their grandparents made, all the way back to the moment Erik the Red stepped ashore and decided that what he had brought with him from Norway was more important than what he had arrived to find. After the wedding, silence. Not the silence of catastrophe, not the silence of plague or conquest or sudden violence. The silence of a candle burning down, slow, complete. The ships that eventually come to the Eastern settlement, and they do come, eventually after years of absence, find empty farms, empty churches, empty fjords. The buildings are intact. The possessions are largely in place. Whatever happened here happened quietly, without drama, without the kind of conclusive event that history prefers because it is easier to narrate. There is no last stand. There is no recorded farewell. There is only the absence, spreading out from the last known point like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. And the stone is a wedding in September, and the water is everything that came after. What became of them? This is the question that the silence refuses to answer, and the silence is generous in its refusal because it leaves open three possibilities, each of which is its own kind of ending, each of which tells a different story about the same people. Perhaps some of them made the crossing. There was a sea route, treacherous and long, to Iceland and to Norway. Perhaps a remnant group, in the last years, gathered what they could carry and pointed a ship east and attempted the journey home. Home to a place most of them had never been. Home to a Norway that was itself diminished by plague and political upheaval. Home to a civilization that had largely forgotten they existed. Perhaps some of them made it. Perhaps the Norse Greenlanders ended not in the Arctic but in a Bergen harbor, stepping ashore into a world that had moved on without them. Strangers in the homeland their ancestors had left 4 centuries before. There is no record of this. There is only the possibility, and the possibility is its own kind of grief. Perhaps some of them walked north. Perhaps, in the final years, when the farms were failing and the churches were cold and the choice between identity and survival had finally become impossible to avoid, some among them made the choice that the civilization as a whole could never make. Perhaps they walked toward the Inuit settlements, toward the people who knew how to live here, and laid down the weight of being Norse and picked up the weight of being alive. Perhaps their descendants are out there, absorbed into Inuit communities, their names changed, their language lost, their blood continuing in people who do not know and cannot know what portion of their inheritance came from a stone church on a fjord where once, on a Sunday in September, a man married a woman and someone wrote it down. There is no record of this either. There is only the possibility, and it is the most hopeful possibility, and hope is a complicated thing to feel at this late hour. Perhaps they simply died. Perhaps the last of them died in their beds, in their farms, in the place they had always lived, and the farms stood empty and the cattle wandered and the church at Halsey held the cold and the light and the silence, and that was all. No crossing, no walk north, just the slow extinguishing of a people who had held on as long as holding on was possible, and then could hold no longer. This too is a kind of dignity. This too is a kind of ending that deserves to be witnessed. We cannot know which of these endings is true. We cannot know if all three are true in different proportions, if the last community fractured in its final years and went three different ways into the future and the silence. We can only know the last confirmed point of light, which is the letter, which is the wedding, which is Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Bjornsdottir standing before God and their neighbors in a stone church above a fjord and making the promises that people make when they intend to have a future. The church at Halsey is still standing. This is the fact that stops you. If you go there, if you stand on that promontory above the fjord and look at what remains, the walls are intact. The doorway is open to the Arctic sky. The stone is the same stone that was fitted into place by Norse hands in a Norse century, and it has outlasted everything: the settlers, the cattle, the bishop, the supply ships, the colony, the civilization that built it, and the civilization that sent it, and the civilization that sent it, and the civilization that forgot it. The Arctic has not been gentle with much, but it has been gentle with this. The church stands. Step into the doorway. Look in. The roof is gone. That was timber, and timber does not last, but the walls hold the space. Define it. Insist on it. This was a room. This was a room where people stood. On a Sunday in September 1408, this room held candles and witnesses and two people making vows, and the room still holds the shape of that, still preserves the outline of that ordinary, extraordinary human act. The way a cast holds the shape of what was poured into it long after the thing itself has gone. This is what the Norse of Greenland leave behind. Not descendants, or very few, not a living culture, not a tradition that continues. They leave behind documents, the letter, the annals, the ecclesiastical records, and they leave behind ruins, and they leave behind this story, which is the story of people who looked at survival and chose themselves instead, who held their identity so tightly and so completely that they held it past the point of their own existence, who were Norse to the last breath and the la. Sent letter, sent across a cold sea to a world that was already forgetting them. The image we are left with is Valsey Church itself, still standing, its stone walls intact, its doorway open to the Arctic sky, and inside it, in our imagination, the ghost of a wedding, the candles, the vows, the witnesses, the ordinary human hope that two people joining their lives might make a future worth having. It is an act of almost unbearable dignity, this wedding at the end of the world. And it is also, we now understand, an act of the same cultural fidelity that made the end of the world inevitable. They were Norse to the last. They held the ceremony. They wrote the letter. And then they were gone. The ships that come to the eastern settlement in the years after 1408 find a landscape that has already begun the slow work of erasure. Grass grows through the flagstone floors of abandoned farmhouses. The cathedral at Garda stands open to a sky that has no use for it. The churchyards hold their dead in consecrated silence, generation upon generation of men and women who crossed an ocean to build something permanent, their faces turned, even in burial, toward a Jerusalem they will never reach. What the ships do not find is any living person who can explain what happened. No survivor, no note, no fire still smoldering in a hearth. Only the landscape doing what landscapes do when the people leave, absorbing, slowly, the evidence that they were ever there. This is the silence that the ships bring back to Norway and Iceland, and it is a silence that has never entirely been filled. Historians and archaeologists have spent centuries trying to fill it. They have proposed plague, that great impersonal killer that was moving through Europe in exactly these decades, though there is no particular evidence it reached this far. They have proposed piracy, the English fishermen and Basque whalers who were pressing into these waters and who were not always peaceful in their encounters with isolated communities. They have proposed that the Norse settlers of Greenland simply left, walked away from the failing farms, found passage on some undocumented vessel, and made their way back to Iceland or Norway, disappearing into the population of a Europe that kept no careful records of returning emigrants. They have proposed, most provocatively, that some portion of them were absorbed by the Inuit, that the last Norse Greenlanders put down the forms of their identity and took up the forms of another, and that their descendants are alive today without knowing it. Each of these theories carries some weight. None of them carries enough. The truest answer, the one that the evidence most honestly supports, is that we do not know. And that uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship. It is part of the meaning. What the bones and the middens do tell us is this. In the final generations of the eastern settlement, the diet shifts. Marine mammals make up a larger and larger proportion of what the colonists are eating. Seal bones appear in the refuse piles with increasing frequency. The cattle are still there, but there are fewer of them, and they are smaller, stunted by generations of insufficient fodder and shortening growing seasons. The colony has contracted to the best farms, the most sheltered fjords, the places where the pasture holds longest against the advancing cold. The people are adapting, slightly, grudgingly, in the manner of people who are adapting without quite admitting to themselves that they are doing so. They are eating what the Arctic offers because the Arctic is no longer offering them a choice. But they are still burying their dead in consecrated ground. They are still maintaining the forms of a Christian Norse community. They are still, in the most fundamental sense, insisting on being what they are. Both things are true at the end, and the tension between them is the colony's final testimony. A people bending at last toward the world they actually inhabit, but not enough, and not in time, and never quite willingly. The walrus ivory trade, which for centuries connected Greenland to the markets of Europe and gave the colony its reason to exist in the eyes of those markets, has already been quietly superseded by the time the silence falls. Portuguese and Spanish ships are working the coast of West Africa in these decades. Elephant ivory, larger, whiter, more easily carved, is beginning to flow into the workshops of European craftsmen in quantities that Greenland's walrus hunters cannot match. The world does not announce this substitution. It does not send a letter. It simply moves on, finding its luxury goods elsewhere, and the people whose survival depended on the world remaining still are left holding a commodity that the world no longer needs. This is the impersonal economic verdict, delivered without malice, which is perhaps what makes it so final. Malice could be argued with. Indifference cannot. Columbus sails in 1492, which is to say he sails into a world where the Norse attempt on the North Atlantic has already been concluded. He carries with him a different set of assumptions, that the lands he reaches can be claimed, converted, exploited, reorganized according to European templates, and in this, He is not different from Erik the Red, who carried the same assumptions to Greenland 5 centuries earlier. What Columbus finds is not empty. What Erik found was not empty. What Erik found was not empty. Both men arrive in landscapes already inhabited, already understood, already organized around principles that their own traditions do not recognize as valid. The Norse look at the Inuit and see Skraelings. Columbus looks at the Taino and sees subjects. The pattern is not aberrant. It is almost archetypal, this refusal to learn from the people who already know the land, this insistence on importing a world rather than entering the one that exists. Norse Greenland is not a curiosity at the edge of history. It is a template, and the template has been used many times since. The Inuit are still in Greenland. This is the documentary's most important fact, and it deserves to be held in the mind without qualification or hedging. The Thule people who were present when the Norse arrived, who were thriving when the climate turned, who continued to thrive as the Norse settlements contracted and fell silent, their descendants are there today. They did not survive by refusing to change. They survived by changing constantly, by treating their culture as a living instrument rather than a sacred object, by understanding that the relationship between a people and its landscape is not a declaration but a conversation, ongoing, requiring perpetual attention and perpetual willingness to be answered. Their Kajate evolved. Their hunting techniques refined themselves across generations in response to what the ice and the water were actually doing. Their clothing, those layered garments of seal and caribou that the Norse observed and declined to adopt, represents not a fixed tradition, but an accumulated wisdom, tested and revised across centuries of actual consequence. To be Inuit in Greenland was not to be frozen in amber. It was to be alive in the fullest sense, responsive, adaptive, present to the specific demands of a specific place. The Norse were also alive, of course. They loved their children and buried their dead and built their churches and kept their faith across 5 centuries on the edge of the known world. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, extraordinary. The sheer tenacity required to maintain a recognizable civilization in Greenland for as long as the Norse managed it is a form of human achievement that deserves acknowledgement before it receives judgment. They were not stupid. They were not passive. They were, by the standards of their time and their tradition, doing everything right, and that is precisely the tragedy. They failed not, despite their best efforts, but because of them. Because their best efforts were organized around a set of assumptions that the landscape of Greenland could not sustain, and because the cost of questioning those assumptions felt, to them, like the cost of ceasing to exist. Culture is the story a people tell about who they are. The Norse story was clear and coherent and deeply held. They were Christian Europeans, inheritors of a tradition that stretched back through Scandinavia to Rome and through Rome to Jerusalem, and their presence in Greenland was an extension of that tradition into new territory, not an invitation to become something else. The Inuit were not a lesson, they were a threat to the boundaries of that story, to the integrity of that identity, to the careful maintenance of a self-understanding that gave life its meaning even when it was making life impossible. To learn from the Inuit would have required the Norse to see the Inuit as teachers, and to see the Inuit as teachers would have required a humility that their entire cultural inheritance argued against. So the Norse watched their neighbors thrive in the same landscape where they were slowly dying, and they held their identity tighter, and they built their churches higher, and they sent their tithes to Rome on ships that were increasingly unlikely to return. This is what the silence teaches. Not that the Norse were uniquely blind, but that the capacity for this particular blindness is not unique to them. Every civilization carries within it the same potential for this failure, the failure of the successful, the inability of people who have built something real and meaningful to recognize when the conditions that made it possible have changed beyond recovery. The Norse had succeeded in Greenland for long enough that their methods of success had become articles of faith, and faith by its nature does not update in response to evidence. The empty farms are the evidence. The standing churches are the evidence. The wandering livestock that Ivar Bardason found in the western settlement, moving through fields without shepherds, are the evidence. The colony did not end with a battle or a plague ship or a dramatic final winter. It ended the way most things end, gradually, then completely, with the last survivors doing the same things the first settlers had done. Because those were the things that made them who they were. The letter from the wedding at Hallsay Church made it back to Iceland. This matters. Someone carried it. Someone thought it was worth carrying, worth preserving, worth the effort of documentation in a community that was by then surely aware of its own precariousness. The witnesses signed their names. The ceremony was performed according to proper rites, and then, at some point after the letter was written, and before the next ship came that might have carried more letters, the eastern settlement reached its conclusion, not with a declaration, not with a last stand, but with the quiet cessation of a community that had simply run out of the conditions it needed to continue. Valsay Church still stands. Its walls are still upright, its stones still dressed, its doorway still open to the Arctic sky and the fjord beyond it. The building has outlasted everything else, the farms, the livestock, the people, the faith that built it. Every summer, a small number of tourists make the journey to see it. People from a world that the Norse settlers of Greenland could not have imagined, traveling in vessels of a kind that would have seemed miraculous to Ivar Bardason, standing in the doorway of a building that outlasted the civilization that built it. They stand there in the Arctic light, and they read, in the silence of the empty interior, the warning that the Norse left behind. The warning is not written anywhere. It does not need to be. The cattle that grazed on thinning pasture are gone. The bishop who may or may not have reached his diocese is gone. The walrus ivory that once commanded the markets of Europe is gone, replaced by ivory from a continent the Norse never knew existed. The tithe that continued flowing toward Rome even after Rome had stopped sending ships is gone, paid into a silence that never answered. The wedding guests who signed their names to a letter in 1408 are gone, their signatures the last evidence of a community that had held itself together by faith and stubbornness and the sheer refusal to become something other than itself for more than 4 centuries at the edge of the known world. What remains is the church. What remains is the open doorway and the dressed stone and the Arctic sky pouring through the windows where there is no longer any glass. What remains is the fjord, exactly as it was, cold and beautiful and indifferent. The same fjord that Erik the Red sailed into in 985 carrying exile and ambition, and the absolute certainty that Norse people, Norse ways, Norse God could be planted here and would hold. They held. For a time, they held. For a time, they held. The Inuit are still here. The church is still here. And the sea, as it has always been, is rises. Culture is not a life raft. It is an anchor. The Norse of Greenland knew who they were, completely and without doubt, until the moment they were no longer anything at all. They chose themselves, and in doing so, they made themselves a monument. Not to failure exactly, but to the specific and recurring human cost of mistaking identity for survival, of holding a story so tightly that you cannot put it down even when putting it down is the only thing that might save you. The empty church says everything. It has been saying it for 600 years. We have only to stand in its doorway and be willing, at last, to hear it.